department at Cal State Fullerton. In addition to teaching, I am a licensed marriage and family therapist and work in Northeast LA in Highland Park. And so I serve largely a BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color population, and serve as an LGBTQIA plus ally, and work from an intersectional perspective and weave mindfulness and attachment and a social justice model within the work that I do with the clients that I serve, because it's relevant and important to mental health in a lot of ways. And so as we unpack it together today, I hope that it maybe makes sense for you and gives you something to think about and how it might impact your own mental health.
Awesome. Thank you, Professor. For everyone else, hi, I'm Leslie. I am an undergraduate student at Cal State Fullerton, currently and officially a double major in public health and nursing, and also minoring in psychology. I'm here to collaborate with Professor Alvarez on the presentation today. I'm currently in her Psychology of Gender class, and we're super excited to present this to you all. Awesome. So just a couple disclosures. So today's discussion will be covering the topics of intersectionality and mental health. Sensitive topics such as racism, oppression, ableism, homophobia, etc. may be mentioned. If at any moment you feel uncomfortable by the conversation, please feel free to step away for a moment. It is important that we discuss all aspects associated with today's topics to provide you all with a clear understanding on the effects and interconnectedness of these topics/issues. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to private message me or Key or another chat monitor if you would like to step away. Okay, so I'll get it started. So today's discussion, like we mentioned, is on intersectionality and mental health. So for those of you who don't know what intersectionality is, I have the definition here. It was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and she described it as it being simply about certain aspects of who a person is and how it increases your access to good things or exposure to bad things. Like many other social justice ideas, it stands because it resonates with people's lives, but because it resonates with people's lives, it's under attack. The term was originally coined from the term interconnectedness, and Kimberly Crenshaw used it to describe the oppression of African American women. And then Professor Alvarez, if you want to kind of elaborate.
Yeah, sure. So a little bit of background on this. It really came to be as a recognition that a woman's experience differed beyond just being a woman. And so this dealt with oppression in the workplace and how Black women in particular, so it did originate in the context of the Black or African American experience in the United States, in the sense that Black women experienced both sexism and racism in a way that white women did not and Black men did not, right? So white women benefited from their whiteness, Black men benefited from being men. And so the experience of a Black woman was an intersection of different levels of oppression. And this has certainly expanded beyond that original context as we look at the many layers of identity and the way that interlocking identities can, as Kimberly Crenshaw says, expose you to potentially more bad things or create access to good things, right? And that is the underlying tenets of privilege and oppression, right? Privilege being there are just obstacles that don't exist in the same way as there are for people who don't have the same privilege. This is really relevant and important because as this definition has expanded, we better understand the role that sexual identity, ableism, both physical and neurological, right? So being neurodiverse, neurodivergent, creates different experiences and different accessibility that I think people are just now really starting to develop awareness of in a meaningful way as we kind of garner more attention around it. And so as we explore these ideas and these dimensions, the direction that we'll go in is the dimensions of identity, in particular, as described by Patricia Arredondo, who is a really wonderful clinical psychologist who does work with Latinx women, immigrant populations, and is one of the major voices in multicultural and cultural psychology. We see how this plays a big role in our experience with the world and our ability to navigate it safely and effectively.
Thank you, Professor. I'm going to switch slides.
And so when we take this context into the therapeutic room, there's already a power system that's at play between the therapist and the client. And so when we don't acknowledge identity and different cultural backgrounds, different experiences that influence an individual's, we call it their phenomenological background. So like all of the things that a person has gone through in their entire life that has led them to this moment. We're overlooking a very important piece of what's happening in the room. And so identities are important, one, because they're not static. We develop different relationships with our identity throughout our life. And I know for myself, it has evolved as I've developed more understanding, as I have become more informed about more global issues, and different, just different experiences that I've had throughout my life where my identities, depending on which one I'm talking about, are more salient than others. Identity confusion, internalized racism, internalized homophobia are developmental issues, right? These are things that impact us throughout our childhood in different ways that in turn impact us as adults. And so it creates this internal conflict that can be, can contribute to anxiety, to depression, to other barriers to kind of living a balanced life when we have this internal discord in that way. For immigrants in particular, for those of you who are interested in working with immigrants or who come from an immigrant background, there is this identity loss that can happen as acculturation occurs, and there's a lot of pressure to acculturate. And so as you are trying to connect with your new home and explore those areas, there's this like pulling in a lot of ways of wanting to remain constant and honor older traditions and cultural values while also exploring these other pieces, which can create tension in the home, especially if there are people who are differentially connected to the original culture as others, right? And so that creates interpersonal concerns as well as intrapersonal concerns. So what does this mean for me as an individual who identifies in this way, but now I'm in this new place? Invisible identities can be a source of shame and doubt. And so there's a statement on the next slide that there are some identities that we can hide better than others, right? There's a difference for someone, for example, who comes from a Latinx background, who can pass as white in some settings, and for those who can't. And what that means and some of the guilt and shame that can be attached to that, because there's an experience of privilege that feels disconnected in other ways. And of course, visible ethnic and racial group members may have more negative experiences because they can't hide that, right? When they walk into a room, it is one of the first things people see, and it shapes not just how they perceive the world, but how the world perceives them in different settings. And so there's no hiding from it. And so when we're looking at all of these different layers of identity and what it means in the psychotherapeutic process, kind of at large, put simply, it's important, right? Because it influences how you see the world, how the world sees you, access to resources, understanding of different practices, um, and honoring the fact that therapy largely comes from a Western white modality that can be incongruent to someone's experience and understanding and recognition of the value that is in therapy as people are starting to begin the process of decolonizing it and looking at different ways to approach mental health that is more inclusive and more diverse. Some general observations about identity. We all have multiple sociocultural identities. Again, some of them feel more relevant in certain settings than others. And there's some that just personally you identify more strongly with than other things. And we can feel these contradictory urges about when we want to fit in, when we want certain identities to be recognized. Some of them, we want them recognized at all times. Other times there are spaces where they feel more important than others. There are some identities that have a higher price in the sense that they belong to groups that are more significantly oppressed and lack social and economic value, which can lead to more distress for the individual. Some people, like I said earlier, have a choice as to whether their identity stays hidden, and others don't. And so this is something that can be tricky for someone to navigate and want to voice their identity in different ways. We're always changing and developing, and the development of an individual identity does not preclude the development of shared identities and goals. And so being a part of a larger group often is very meaningful for people. And there's a lot of value in the shared experiences. I mean, if we just kind of think about social media and like TikTok, there are a lot of very specific cultural references that feel really special when you see them and you're like, oh, my family does that too, right? Or there's like an inside joke that you get to laugh at because you understand the context in which it's happening, because it's a part of this larger complex system of identity. And that's true in the experience of generations, right? We have this like millennial versus Gen Z versus, all these other kind of generational groups, that there's these shared experiences because you go through it kind of as a cohort, and it shapes your understanding of the world in meaningful ways, right? And there's something kind of tongue in cheek, and like you have like that wink of like, oh, I get that because I went through it too, right? And so your individual identity in some ways is a part of these larger interconnected identities, as well as sometimes a rejection of those same things, right? And so how do we understand our individualness in the context of our communities? This is, again, comes from Arredondo, and she has a perspective of the dimensions of identity and being kind of split up in 3 different dimensions: A dimensions, B dimensions, C dimensions. And we can go through this and kind of self-describe or self-label ourselves as which dimension, which of these we fall into, what is our age, culture, ethnicity, etc. And kind of recognize that there are going to be some that feel more important, are prioritized for us, and there are some that are going to shift. And so the way it's broken down this way is A dimensions really aren't as malleable in the same way as maybe B dimensions are. These B dimensions are kind of developmental in the sense that it's you transition from being like a high school graduate to potentially a college graduate to, you know, dropping out of college or whatever else. You can move pretty easily. Your hobbies and recreational interests shift as you know, change and grow. And then finally, our C dimensions, and these are things that are lived experience. So what are these like bigger themes that we are living through that in turn influence all of this, right? For example, we're living through the shared experience of the COVID-19 pandemic. And our experience with COVID-19 varies significantly on some of these issues, right? And so if you come from a more financially secure background, it's going to be a lot easier to quarantine, to work from home, to get your groceries delivered, to order food in, to have, you know, an array of masks to choose from as one piece. And then we can look at these sociopolitical intersections within this as well, in the sense that coming from Asian, American, Pacific Islander backgrounds put you in a much more vulnerable category for potential violence, discrimination, racism, because of the rhetoric that surrounded COVID-19 that shaped the experience in a different way than someone who didn't come from that background, right? And so even though these are larger shared experiences, our, you know, more individual dimensions will shape our experience with that. I'd love for you all to take a moment and fill out your dimensions, right? So what are your A dimensions? What are your B dimensions? And what are maybe some of the most salient lived experiences that you've had historically or sociopolitically, right? We have COVID-19, depending on how old you are. We have 9/11. We have the insurrection at the Capitol. You know, I mean, just this year alone, we have had a lot of different moments to choose from, but maybe think about the one that has resonated the most for you. And we'll give you all a little bit of time to work on that.
Do we want to give them like 5 minutes?
Yeah, about 5 minutes to.
Okay, awesome. At 11:50, I'll pause the recording to see if folks want to share.
My bad. Just trying to put more.
Alrighty, we should be wrapping it up. If you're not completely sure about certain dimensions, that's okay. As we go through the workshop, you'll become a little bit more familiar on what these dimensions might mean to you. Professor, did you want me to go to the next slide? Oh, you're muted.
If we could just stay here for just a second longer, and we have a couple of people who shared in the chat